He didn't want love. He wanted obedience. And the woman who stepped off that train gave him neither. Montana, 1887. A hard man. A letter that ordered a wife like ordering livestock, and a woman who had crossed an ocean with fire in her eyes and iron in her spine. They would clash. They would wound each other. And in one deadly winter night, with a blizzard sealing the ranch from the world and a fever burning her alive, he would have to choose between the walls he had spent his whole life building and the woman he could no longer imagine living without. This is the story of Elias and Greta Mercer, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let me see how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere, because it starts right now. Montana, autumn, 1887. The letter had taken Elias Mercer 3 weeks to write. Not because he was a man of many doubts, he wasn't. Elias Mercer had built his ranch from frozen ground and broken-backed labor, had buried 2 horses, 1 foreman, and enough failed seasons to make a lesser man weep himself hollow. Doubt was a luxury he could not afford and had long since stopped entertaining. No, the letter took 3 weeks because he kept crossing out words. Companion. Too soft. It implied something he wasn't ready to name. Assistant. Too cold, even for him, and he was a man the neighboring ranchers called the Glacier when they thought he couldn't hear them. Partner. Closer. But it carried its own complications, suggested equality of say, and Elias had worked too hard for this land to share its direction with someone who didn't understand it. He had finally settled on something simpler, something that said what he meant without the clutter of sentiment. I require a wife. Practical. Hardworking. Quiet. Someone who understands that a ranch is a living thing that demands everything from everyone on it. I am not a difficult man. I am simply a man who has no patience for disorder. He'd sent it to the matchmaker's agency in Chicago, the one the widow Hargrove in town had used when her neighbor's son needed a bride. He'd paid the fee, provided a modest description of the land, and then gone back to work, because that was what men like Elias Mercer did. They made decisions and then moved through them without looking back. That had been 4 months ago, or the letter that came in return, her letter, the one written in a hand so precise and forceful it looked like it had been pressed into the paper through sheer will, had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September. He'd read it once, then he'd folded it and placed it under the loose board beneath his desk, where he kept the ranch's most important documents, the deed, the water rights agreement with the county, the accounting ledgers. He didn't read it again, but he knew every word of it by heart before the week was out, which irritated him more than he would ever admit to a living soul. Mr. Mercer, she had written. I am Greta Vogel, 28 years of age, presently residing in Chicago, but native to a village outside Hamburg, Germany, where my family has farmed the same land for 4 generations. I can cook, preserve, sow, manage livestock, and keep accounts. I am not afraid of hard work or hard winters. I am, however, not a quiet woman when I believe something important needs to be said, and I think it is only honest to tell you this now rather than have you surprised by it later. If these terms are acceptable to you, I will arrive by train on the 14th of October. If they are not, I wish you well in your search. He'd replied with 2 words. Terms accepted. The morning of October 14th arrived gray and mean, the sky the color of old pewter, the wind carrying the first real teeth of winter. Elias had ridden into Coldwater Creek, the closest thing to a town within 20 miles, at 7 in the morning, hitched his horse outside the general store, and waited. The train wasn't due until noon. He told himself he'd come early because he had supplies to collect. This was partially true. He collected the supplies in 40 minutes and then stood on the platform for 3 more hours with the collar of his coat turned up against the wind, watching the horizon where the rail line curved out of sight around the base of the mountains. Hank Bellamy, who ran the livery stable and was constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, sauntered over at 10:30. "Mail-order bride coming in today, I hear," Hank said, with the particular tone men used when they were trying to sound casual about something they found enormously entertaining. "A wife," Elias said. "Not a package." Sure. Hank worked a piece of tobacco to the other side of his mouth. "She German, they say." "She is. Gonna be real interesting watching you manage a German woman. Hank grinned, the gap in his front teeth making the expression look more like a wound than a smile. My grandmother was from Hamburg, stubborn as a cast-iron post, God rest her. Wouldn't budge on a thing she'd decided, not if you lit her on fire. Elias said nothing. I'm just saying, Hank continued, maybe loosen up a little before she arrives. First impression and all. Hank, yeah? Go away. Hank went away, still grinning. The train arrived 7 minutes late. Elias stood at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands. He'd taken it off without deciding to, and watched the passengers step down one by one. A family with 3 shrieking children, an older man in a minister's collar, 2 cowboys who smelled of the stockyards, a woman in green silk who looked at Coldwater Creek with the particular horror of someone realizing they had made a terrible mistake. And then her. She came down the steps last, carrying a single large trunk that a porter was struggling to manage, and that she clearly felt he was managing wrong, because she said something sharp to him in German and then took one of the handles herself and helped lower it to the platform with far more efficiency than the situation had previously demonstrated. She was not what he had pictured. He wasn't sure what he'd pictured exactly. Something softer, perhaps. Something that would slot quietly into the spaces of his life without requiring adjustment. What stood on the platform before him was a woman of medium height, with shoulders squared like she was braced for weather, dark blonde hair pinned severely under a practical hat, and eyes, he noticed the eyes even from 15 feet away, that were the color of a winter sky right before it decided to do something serious. She scanned the platform without any of the nervous fluttering he'd half expected. Her gaze moved methodically, assessing until it landed on him. She didn't smile. Neither did he. She picked up the smaller of her bags and walked toward him at a pace that meant business. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her English was precise, strongly accented, and completely without apology. "Miss Vogel." She looked at him with those winter sky eyes and seemed to be arriving at a number of conclusions simultaneously. "You are taller than I expected. You are—" He stopped himself. "I am what?" "Punctual," he said. "The train was 7 minutes late. You were the last off." I was ensuring my trunk was handled correctly. It was not, until I stepped in. She glanced toward the trunk, which the porter had abandoned with obvious relief. "Is your wagon here?" "Yes." "Good. I would like to see the ranch before dark." She picked up her bag. "Lead the way, Mr. Mercer." He stood still for one moment, just one, with the strange sensation of a man who has ordered something from a catalog and opened the package to find that what arrived is nothing like the description and considerably more than he'd paid for. Then he led the way. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours. For the first 40 minutes, neither of them spoke. This was the silence Elias preferred, purposeful, undemanding, filled only with the sounds of the horses and the wind through the grass. He'd spent years cultivating this silence. It was his natural environment. Greta sat beside him on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, and he got the impression she was not a woman uncomfortable with silence either, which he found, against his intentions, slightly reassuring. It was she who broke it eventually. "How many head of cattle?" 240. "How many horses?" 11. 4 working, 2 breeding mares, 3 young stock, and 2 that are older. "What do you do with the older ones?" "Keep them. They've earned it." She looked at him briefly. "That is a more generous policy than I expected." "A horse that's worked 15 years on this land deserves a quiet end," he said, without particular feeling. It was simply a fact. I don't put animals down for the sin of getting old. Another silence. The mountains ahead of them had turned blue with distance and the first promise of snow. "The house," she said. "How large?" 4 rooms. Main room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms. There's a sleeping loft above the kitchen that was meant for ranch hands but is empty now. 3 men work the property year-round. They bunk in the building behind the main barn. 4 rooms, she repeated, and something in her voice was doing calculations. "It's a working ranch, not a hotel," he said, more defensively than he intended. "I didn't say anything critical, Mr. Mercer." "Your tone did." She turned to look at him then, and for a moment something sparked in those gray eyes that might have been amusement, though it was gone before he could be sure. "I was calculating storage," she said simply. My mind goes to practical matters. It is a habit. A useful one, on a ranch. Yes, she agreed. I thought so. The homestead came into view as the last light of afternoon stretched long and gold across the valley floor. It was not a beautiful property, not in any conventional sense. Beauty required ornamentation, and every choice Elias had made about this land was functional, but it was solid. The main house sat square and well chinked against the cold. The barn was twice the size it needed to be because he'd built for expansion rather than present need, and the fence lines ran straight and true to the horizon. He watched Greta's face as the wagon crested the final rise and the whole spread came into view. She was quiet for a long moment. The fence posts are good timber, she said finally. I don't cut corners on the things that hold. No, she agreed, still looking at the property. I can see that. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, then turned to offer her a hand, a formality he felt he should observe, regardless of his own preferences about formality. She took it, stepped down without depending on it, and released it quickly. He opened the front door and stood aside. She walked in. He watched her move through the main room, taking in the sparse furniture, the cold hearth, the bare walls, the complete absence of anything that wasn't strictly necessary. She didn't comment. She moved into the kitchen, opened 2 cupboard doors, examined the wood stove with the focused attention of a craftsman inspecting a stranger's work, and then walked back into the main room. Which bedroom is mine? She asked. The one on the right. I took the left. She nodded, went to the door, opened it, and looked in. He followed far enough to see it through her eyes. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small window, a hook on the wall. He'd put clean sheets on the mattress and replaced the pillow, which had been old. He wasn't sure why he'd done that. He told himself it was because a reasonable employer would provide adequate bedding for an employee. She set her small bag on the floor inside the door. Then she turned and faced him in the doorway, and there was something direct and clear in her expression that made him feel, unaccountably, as though he were the one being assessed for hire. We should discuss expectations, she said. I put them in the letter. You put some of them in the letter. There are things letters don't cover. She folded her hands. I will work this ranch as hard as you work it. I will keep your house, manage your stores, and do whatever the property requires of me. I am not too proud for hard labor. I have been doing it since I was 9 years old. A pause. But I am not a servant, Mr. Mercer. I am a wife. There is a difference, and I will need you to remember it. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. I'm aware of the legal distinction, he said. I am not speaking of legal distinctions. Her voice was even, but it had an edge that reminded him, absurdly, of the sound a blade made when you ran it across a whetstone. I'm speaking of the way you will speak to me, of whether my opinion on matters of this ranch will be heard or ignored, of whether I'm a partner or furniture. A long silence. The wind pressed against the house. I'm not an easy man, Elias said finally. I did not come here looking for an easy man. She held his gaze. I came here to build something worth having. I believe that is what you want as well. Am I wrong? He looked at her for a long moment. The dying light through the window fell across the side of her face and turned her hair the color of dry grass in late summer. No, he said. You're not wrong. Good. She straightened slightly. Then we understand each other. Now, I would like to start supper. Show me where you keep the provisions. She made a soup that first night from dried beans and the last of the autumn vegetables, seasoned with something she'd brought in her bag, and the smell of it filled the cold house and got into every corner of it. Elias sat at the table he'd eaten at alone for 11 years and tried not to make it obvious that he was experiencing something uncomfortable. It wasn't the soup, though the soup was better than anything he'd made himself, and he was a competent cook by frontier standards. It was the presence of it. The sounds from the kitchen, the warmth that came from someone moving through spaces where no one had moved in years. She set a bowl in front of him without ceremony, took the seat across the table, and folded her hands briefly, some private ritual of her own, and then reached for her spoon. You'll want to rechink the north wall of the barn before winter fully sets in, she said, breaking a piece of bread. There's a gap at the second beam that the wind will exploit. I saw it as we drove past. He stared at her. I walked the property while you unhitched the horses. she said, as though this were obvious. "I like to know what I'm working with." He thought of the gap in the barn's north wall, which he'd known about for 3 weeks and had been planning to address before the first snow. He thought of Hank Bellamy's grandmother from Hamburg. He thought of the letter under the board beneath his desk. "I am not a quiet woman when I believe something important needs to be said." He picked up his spoon. "I know about the gap," he said. "I didn't say you didn't. I said it should be addressed before winter." "It will be." "When? Saturday?" She nodded. "I will help. It will go faster with 2. He opened his mouth to say that it wouldn't require help, that he'd been re-chinking barn walls alone since before she was born, probably, and then he closed it again. Because the truth, which he was not yet willing to examine too closely, was that it would go faster with 2. "Saturday," he said. She nodded again and returned to her soup. The wind moved around the house. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, one of the horses made a low, settling sound in the barn. Elias ate his soup and said nothing more. And across the table, neither did Greta. And the silence between them was a different kind of silence from the one he was used to. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but alive in a way that the other silences never had been. He did not examine that too closely either. The first real fight happened on the 3rd day. It was over the storage of the winter flour supply. 40 pounds of it that Elias had stacked in the corner of the root cellar the way he always had, in a spot that Greta had determined was prone to moisture accumulation from the stone wall. She'd moved it to the opposite shelf while he was out mending a fence line. He'd come in, gone to the cellar to inventory against his records, and found the stacks rearranged. He came upstairs with the particular set to his jaw that his ranch hands had learned to identify and evacuate from. "You moved the flour." She was at the table going through the household accounts, which she'd asked to see that morning and which he'd given her because he couldn't think of a reason not to that didn't sound petty. She didn't look up. "I did. I had it where I wanted it. You had it where moisture will get into it by January. I moved it to the dry shelf." Now she looked up. "You're welcome. I didn't ask you to reorganize my cellar. You didn't need to ask. The flour was going to spoil." She set down the pencil with a precise, deliberate movement. "I was not rearranging things for the pleasure of rearranging them, Mr. Mercer. I was preventing a loss." "On my ranch," he said. "My decisions. About your flour, which will rot if you put it back." They stared at each other. The kitchen felt very small. "If you want to move something in this house," he said, keeping his voice level with effort, "you ask first. And if there is no time to ask, if the decision needs to be made while you are 3 miles out on a fence line, then you wait until I'm back and you ask. And if the flour spoils in the meantime—" Greta, the first time he'd used her name. He hadn't meant it to come out the way it did, like something being held down by force. She rose from her chair, slow and deliberate, and stood across the table from him with those winter sky eyes completely level and not the slightest bit retreating. "I did not come here to be a decoration," she said. "I came to be useful. And I cannot be useful if every useful thing I do is treated as an offense." She picked up the accounts ledger and held it out. "Your records show a $4 loss on flour spoilage in December of last year and $6 the year before. That is $10 you did not need to lose. The flour is now on the dry shelf. When it is safely through winter without spoilage, you will know I was right." She set the ledger on the table. "I would like to be wrong about this, Mr. Mercer. I genuinely would, but I do not think I am." He took the ledger. He looked at the line items she had marked, the flour losses, the dates, the figures, his own handwriting in the columns, tallying his own failures back at him. He put the ledger down. He walked back to the cellar stairs, went down, and looked at the flour on the dry shelf and at the dark stain of old moisture on the stone of the opposite wall. When he came back up, Greta was sitting again, pencil back in hand, eyes on the accounts. "The east wall of this root cellar also needs remortaring," he said. "I'll do it before the first frost." A pause. She didn't look up. "Good," she said quietly. He put on his coat and went back out to the fence line. But something had shifted, small and tectonic, in the architecture of his understanding about what this marriage was actually going to be. September turned into October's deeper cold. October hardened toward November. And the ranch, his ranch, the one he'd managed alone for over a decade, began to change in ways that were difficult to argue with. Greta was everywhere, and she was relentless. She rose before him and was in the kitchen before he had his boots on. She learned the names of all three ranch hands: Tom, the older one, who'd worked for Elias for 6 years; Charlie, who was 22 and half in love with the idea of the frontier; and Reed, who was quiet and good with horses. And she learned how they took their coffee and what they would eat without complaint versus what required negotiation. And she managed the food situation with the efficiency of a quartermaster who had studied the campaign. Tom told Elias one morning, with the particular care of a man choosing words around a sleeping bear, that the biscuits Miss Vogel made were the best he'd eaten in 20 years. Elias said nothing, but he ate 4 of them. She had opinions about everything: the placement of tools, the rotation of the pasture fields, the way the ice house had been packed, which she said was leaving air pockets that would cost them in the summer. She presented these opinions with the directness of someone who'd grown up in a culture where saying what you meant was not a social liability but a basic courtesy. She never apologized for having a view. She was sometimes, often, correct. This was the thing Elias found hardest to accommodate. Not her presence, not even her stubbornness, but the frequency with which she was right about things he thought he knew better than anyone. The ice house repacking she'd suggested saved them 12% on summer ice costs. He did the math and didn't tell her, but something in the set of his shoulders changed that day, and she noticed it, because she noticed everything. "You're angry about the ice house," she said one evening. "I'm not angry." "You have a particular way of being not angry that looks exactly like being angry. It is very thorough." He looked up from the book he was reading, or pretending to read. "What do you want me to say?" "You were right." I adjusted. "I don't want you to say anything." She was mending a split in one of his work shirts with the mechanical efficiency of someone doing something they could do in their sleep. "I want you to understand that being right about a thing is not an attack on you." "I understand that." "Do you?" She looked up from the shirt. "Because you have been carrying yourself for 3 days like a man who's been told he's been doing everything wrong. You've told me I was wrong about the ice house, about the grain elevator, about specific things, not about everything." She lowered the shirt to her lap. "You have built something real here, Mr. Mercer. This land, this operation, it is impressive. I do not say that to soften a blow. I say it because it is true." A pause. "But nothing that is good cannot be made better. This is not an insult. It is simply the nature of things." The fire snapped in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the tree line. "Elias," he said. She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My name. It's Elias." He turned a page he hadn't read. "You've been here 6 weeks. You can use it." A very brief pause, and then she returned to the shirt. "Elias," she said, testing the shape of it. Just once. Like she was assessing whether it fit. Apparently it did, because she didn't say anything more. And somehow that was enough. November arrived with a hard frost that killed the last of the garden's stubborn holdouts overnight. Elias found Greta in the garden at first light, salvaging what could be salvaged and composting what couldn't, working quickly and without complaint in the gray cold. Her breath made clouds in the air. Her hands were bare because she'd forgotten her gloves. He brought them to her, just walked up and held them out without saying anything. She took them, put them on, kept working. "I was going to get them," she said. "I know. But thank you." He went to the other end of the row she was working and began harvesting from the opposite direction. They worked toward each other in silence, breath misting, hands moving through the cold-killed plants. And when they met in the middle, she looked at him briefly with something in her expression that was neither the challenge nor the measured assessment he'd learned to read. He didn't know what to do with what it was, so he picked up the harvest basket and carried it to the cellar. But he thought about it for the rest of the day. The community of Coldwater Creek had been watching the Mercer-Vogel arrangement with the focused attention of people who didn't have enough entertainment and weren't ashamed to admit it. Opinion ran predominantly to skepticism. Elias Mercer was considered handsome enough in a bleak, weathered way, and successful enough in a grim, relentless way. But likable was not a word that had ever been comfortably applied to him. And the consensus in town was that a foreign woman with an independent nature was either going to break or bolt before the snow got serious. Margaret Holt, the postmistress, Told anyone who'd listen that she gave it until Thanksgiving. Doc Ellison said Christmas was charitable. Hank Bellamy, who'd seen the woman step off the train, said he wasn't putting money on the timeline either way, but he'd sell tickets to watch the ongoing proceedings. What none of them had accounted for was Greta Vogel's particular quality of endurance. Not the loud, dramatic endurance of someone proving a point, but the quiet, fundamental endurance of a person who had decided that a thing was worth doing and was therefore going to do it for as long as it needed to be done. She charmed no one. She didn't try to, but she did the same thing in human terms that she'd done with the flower in the ice house. She assessed the situation accurately, identified the specific problems, and addressed them directly. She sat with Margaret Holt for an hour when she came to collect the mail, not making small talk but asking with genuine interest about the mail route, the volume, the challenges of the job in a community this size. Margaret found herself talking for 45 minutes and came away not entirely sure how it had happened. She told the doctor, when her youngest developed a persistent cough, exactly what symptoms she'd observed and in what sequence and what had and hadn't helped, and gave him information he could actually use instead of the vague worrying he usually received from ranch families. He told his wife that evening that the Mercer woman was either a very good observer or had some medical training, and probably both. She was not making friends. Not exactly. But she was becoming, slowly and without any particular effort at campaign, a person the town could locate and categorize, which was better than the unsettling foreignness they'd been projecting onto her from a distance. Elias noticed. He said nothing about it because saying things about feelings and perceptions was not a mechanism his personality had developed, but he noticed. There was one evening in late November, the month turning dark and sharp-edged, the sky above Montana so full of stars it looked like a deliberate excess. When he came in late from a difficult calving that had gone wrong in the usual ways, and then a few extra, cold to the bone, and tired past the point of ordinary tired, and found the house warm. Not just heated. Warm. There was a difference, though he couldn't have explained it before that night. She'd kept supper for him. Hadn't known when he'd be back, but had kept it warm anyway. And it was on the table by the time he'd washed his hands and sat down, and she'd come in from whatever she'd been doing in the kitchen and sat across from him while he ate, because she'd apparently determined without being asked that a man who'd been out in the cold dealing with a calving crisis didn't need to eat alone. She didn't pepper him with questions. She simply sat and drank her tea and let him be present in the warmth of a room that felt, for the first time in more years than he wanted to count, like more than 4 walls and a roof. After a while, he said, "The calf didn't make it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. It happens. I know it does. That doesn't mean you're wrong to be sorry about it." He looked up from his plate. "You look like a man who's been told he's not allowed to be sorry about things," she said quietly, without any particular judgment. Just observation. Just that clear-eyed accuracy of hers turned at full strength in his direction. He put his fork down, looked at the table. Something moved in the region of his chest that he had not felt move in a very long time, and the instinct of 11 years told him to press it back down, to cover it over with the same silence that had served him so well. But the room was warm. She was across the table, and the silence that rose between them this time was not the kind he could disappear into. "My father," he started, and then stopped. She waited. "My father didn't believe in being sorry about things," he said slowly, like a man walking ground he doesn't trust. He said it was self-indulgent, that things happened and you moved through them and you didn't waste time on what couldn't be fixed. He picked up his fork again, set it down again. "I ran this ranch alone for 11 years because I was good at that, at moving through things." "Yes," she said. "I can see that. I'm not sure it's entirely a virtue." "No," she agreed quietly. "I don't think it entirely is." The fire settled in the hearth. The stars wheeled invisibly above the dark roof. In the barn, one of the horses moved in its sleep, the sound carrying faint and familiar through the cold night. Elias Mercer, who had spent 11 years mastering the art of needing nothing, sat across a table from his wife, who was not the wife he had wanted, not the quiet, orderly, manageable wife he'd written for in careful, crossed-out words, and felt something underneath the careful construction of his life shift, just slightly, like ground remembering it was capable of movement. He did not name it, but it had a name, and outside the first real snow of winter had begun to fall. The snow that had begun falling that November night did not stop for 3 days. When it finally relented, the ranch sat buried under 14 inches of white silence, and Elias found himself performing a calculation he hadn't anticipated, the mental measurement of how much more manageable the morning chores had become with 2 sets of hands doing them. He didn't share this calculation with anyone. He filed it under operational efficiency and moved on, because that was the kind of man he'd trained himself to be. A man who dealt in facts and let the inconvenient ones collect dust in the back of his mind where they couldn't trouble him. But the facts kept accumulating. December arrived, and with it the full weight of a Montana winter, the kind that didn't negotiate and didn't apologize, that came in off the mountains like a judgment and settled over the valley with the particular patience of something that knew it had all the time in the world. The temperature dropped below 0 on the 3rd night of the month and didn't climb back above it for a week. The horses needed checking twice a day. The water lines required constant monitoring. The cattle had to be brought in from the outer pasture and managed in the winter paddock, which required all 3 ranch hands and half of Elias's waking hours. Through all of it, Greta moved. She rose every morning before first light. He could hear her in the kitchen, the particular sounds of the stove being fed and water being set to heat, sounds that had become, without his permission, the signal his body used to determine that the day had started and could be entered. She managed the food stores with the precision of a general managing a campaign, stretching what they had against the calculus of how long the winter might run. She kept the hands fed, the house heated, and the accounts updated with a fidelity to detail that he'd never managed to achieve in the same ledgers. And she did all of this without complaint, without martyrdom, without the particular female suffering he'd braced himself for. The sighing, the pointed silences of a different kind, the reminders of how hard everything was. Greta Vogel did not operate that way. When something was hard, she did it harder. When something was unpleasant, she got through it without narrating the unpleasantness to anyone. The cold, the isolation, the backbreaking labor of winter ranch work. She absorbed it all with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything else. It was Tom who finally said what Elias had been refusing to say. They were in the barn one afternoon, the 2 of them checking on the older horses, the cold so sharp inside that their breath made white clouds between them. Tom had been with Elias long enough to know how silence worked around him, which silences could be walked into and which ones were load-bearing walls that shouldn't be disturbed. This one, he'd apparently decided, could bear some weight. She's something, Tom said simply, rubbing down the older mare's flank. She does the work, Elias said. Does more than the work. Tom moved to the next stall, unhurried. Charlie told me she showed him how to treat that horse's hoof rot without losing half a day of his time. Reed says she figured out the hay storage situation before the damp got into the second batch. A pause. And her biscuits are still the best I've had. That is not a small thing. I'll convey your compliments. She'd probably rather have them direct. Tom glanced at him with the sideways look of a man being careful. She's a straight talker. You could try it sometime. Elias looked at him steadily. Tom. Yeah. Mind the horses. Tom smiled at the mare's neck and minded the horses. But the word stayed with Elias through the rest of the afternoon and into the blue dark of the early winter evening when he came in from the barn and found Greta at the table with the ranch map spread before her, a lamp pulled close, and something in her expression that looked like concentrated thought turned inward. She didn't look up when he came in. He unlaced his boots, hung his coat, washed his hands, and by the time he turned around, she had closed the top map and was folding it back with careful creases. The eastern fence line, she said. What about it? On the survey map, there's a section that runs along what looks like a seasonal creek bed. I was trying to determine if that's the section you had trouble with last spring. Tom mentioned a stretch of fence that went down in the melt. He stood very still. You've been talking to Tom about the property. I talk to everyone about everything. It is how I learn things. She glanced up then, reading something in his face. Is that a problem? They work for me, not for... He stopped. Not for me, she finished. No heat in it, just precision. The word wife sat between them like an object neither of them was moving to pick up. I was going to say, not for the management committee, Elias said. Something shifted in her expression. Not amusement exactly, but something in the vicinity. I see. And is there a management committee on this ranch, or just one manager? Just one. And his name is Elias Mercer. It is. Then we agree. She stood folding the last map. I'm not trying to manage your ranch, Elias. I'm trying to understand it. There is a difference. She set the maps in the order she'd found them and pushed them across the table toward him. The eastern fence. Is it the section along the creek bed? A beat. He sat down at the table across from her. Not a decision, just a thing that happened, and pulled the top map back open. Yes, he said. 12 posts went down in the April melt last year. I replaced them in May, but I didn't grade the drainage the way I should have. He tapped the relevant stretch with one finger. It'll happen again unless I address the water flow. She looked at the map. Then she said carefully, in Germany, my father had a similar problem on the eastern edge of the property. He dug a shallow diversion channel here, her finger moved across the map, to redirect the spring runoff before it could undermine the posts. It took 2 men 3 days, but the fence stayed standing for the next 12 years. He studied where she'd pointed. The logic of it was sound, obvious even, in retrospect. He'd been thinking about the fence and not about the water. She'd been thinking about the water. I know how to dig a channel, he said. I'm sure you do. I should have done it last summer. Yes, but you'll do it this spring. She moved toward the kitchen. Are you hungry? I kept something from supper. He was still looking at the map. I didn't ask for a partner, he said, not to start something, just because it was true. And he was working toward being honest about true things when they mattered. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, turned halfway. I know, she said. You asked for a quiet, hard-working, obedient wife who wouldn't bother you with opinions. A beat, and something in her voice that was neither judgment nor softness, but something that lived in the precise space between them. I'm sorry I couldn't manage the quiet. I'm not sorry about the rest of it. He turned a page on the map that didn't need turning. I'll have the soup, he said, and she went to heat it. The thing about Greta, the thing that Elias spent the whole of December coming to terms with, in the slow, resistant way he did most things, was that she had a quality he'd never been able to name in another person and had therefore never known to look for. She was exactly as she presented herself to be. There was no performance to her, no management of impression, no gap between what she said and what she meant, or what she meant and what she did. He had grown up in a world of gaps. His father had been a man of proclamations, pronouncements about hard work and self-sufficiency and the weakness of sentiment, who had died in debt, in bitterness, and in a house where no one particularly grieved him when he was gone. Elias had learned early that what people said was often decoration, and what they did was the only reliable text. Greta's 2 texts matched, completely, consistently, without apparent effort. He found this, and he would never have said this aloud, not to Tom, not to anyone, not even to himself if he could help it. Extraordinary. December deepened. The days shortened to a gray smear of pale light between 2 darknesses. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Elias came in from the late check of the cattle to find that the fire was high, and the table had been moved slightly toward the hearth, and Greta was sitting at it with 2 cups of something hot and a look of calm, deliberate intention. Sit, she said. He sat. He took the cup. It was coffee, real coffee, not the stretched chicory blend they'd been rationing, and looked at her across the table. I used the good coffee, she said. I decided the longest night of the year was a sufficient reason. I don't disagree. Good. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. Outside, the wind was something elemental and enormous. Inside, the fire was small and specific and warm. Tell me something about yourself, she said. He looked at her. Such as? Anything. You choose. Her eyes were steady on his. We have been living in the same house for 2 months, Elias. I know how you take your coffee and how long you check the cattle and what you sound like when something has gone wrong with the operation and you're deciding not to mention it, but I don't know anything else about you. There isn't much else to know. I don't believe that. He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. He turned the cup in his hands. I grew up in Ohio, he said finally. My father had a farm there, smaller than this, less well managed. He looked into the cup. I came west when I was 22 because the land out here was cheap and I had enough money saved from 6 years of working other men's land to start something. I didn't know anyone here. I built this place from nothing. A pause. That's not an uncommon story. No, she agreed, but it's yours. She was watching him with that attention of hers. Not intrusive, not greedy for detail, but simply present, simply there. Why Montana specifically? I saw a photograph in a newspaper. Mountains in the background, a valley, late summer light. He shook his head slightly. Sounded foolish when I say it aloud. It doesn't sound foolish. She was quiet for a moment. I came here from Hamburg on a boat that took 11 days and smelled of fish and misery. I had $40 and the address of a cousin in Chicago who had agreed to take me in temporarily. The cousin's house had 12 people in it, and I slept in the kitchen for a year and worked in a laundry 6 days a week. She looked at the fire. I came west because the cousin's husband, a well-meaning, tedious man, kept telling me I needed to be more modest in my expectations. That a woman from Germany with limited English and no connections should be grateful for what she had. A pause. I have never been good at being told what to be. I noticed. Something in her expression moved, an almost smile, the kind that never quite made it to the surface but changed the whole face anyway. I wanted space, she said simply. That is what the West meant to me when I thought about it. Space. Room to be the size of a person I actually was, instead of squeezing myself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what I should be. Elias looked at her for a long moment. And did you find it? She looked back at him steadily. I'm still deciding, she said, and her voice was honest and without edge, and meant more by that honesty than 3 months of more comfortable answers would have. He nodded, drank his coffee, looked at the fire. I'll think about the drainage channel this week, he said. When the ground firms up enough to hold a plan, we can look at the eastern fence together. It was not what she'd asked for, but it was what he had to give in that moment from where he was standing, and she received it with the same calm precision she received everything. All right, she said. They sat with the fire and the wind until the cups were empty. The new year came quietly. No celebration, no ceremony, just the turning of a page in the accounting ledger that Greta had taken over so completely by then that Elias had stopped pretending to maintain a parallel set of records. January hit the valley like something punitive, driving temperatures so far below zero that the air itself seemed to splinter, and for 2 weeks the ranch existed in a state of pure, focused survival. Keep the animals alive, keep the water moving, keep the people from freezing, sleep, repeat. It was in this extreme weather that the town finally got its definitive read on what was happening at the Mercer Ranch. Alma Schreiber, whose husband ran the grain elevator in Coldwater Creek, had a daughter who'd married into the property adjacent to the Mercer land on the south side. The daughter, young Mrs. Patterson, who had grown up in Cincinnati and still hadn't entirely forgiven the frontier for existing, had been watching the Mercer homestead with the telescopic interest of someone with too few neighbors and too much time in cold weather. She reported back to her mother with meticulous regularity. What she reported was not what anyone had expected. The Mercer place, she said, was running better than it had in years. The German woman had done something to the food storage that had stopped the spoilage problem the ranch had always had. She'd seen the cattle moved with a precision that suggested better management. She'd noticed, and she found this particularly interesting, that Elias Mercer, who had previously communicated with his neighboring community in the monosyllables of a man who considered conversation a trespass, had been seen in town twice in January, which was twice more than his usual cold weather total, and both times he'd been accompanied by his wife, and both times he had stood just close enough to her that it looked like something other than mere proximity. Alma brought this intelligence to the post office with the careful casualness of a woman managing a currency she didn't want to devalue by rushing. Margaret Holt listened to the full account. She was quiet for a moment, sorting letters with the automatic efficiency of many years at the job. Huh, she said. I know, said Alma. I had them lasting until Christmas at best. We all did. She's tougher than we thought. She's tougher than anyone we've ever seen, said Alma, with a tone of honest assessment that didn't try to be more than that. I'm not sure what Elias Mercer knew he was asking for when he wrote that letter, but I don't think he knew it was going to be her. Margaret thought about this. I don't think he did either, she said. The question is what he's going to do about it. This was, in fact, the same question that had been running in some quiet underground current beneath Elias's daily operations for weeks. He was not a man who spent time examining his own interior landscape. He had, over the years, developed a very thorough system of not doing this, of keeping the surface practical and the depths undisturbed. It had served him well in the way that a well-maintained but sealed room serves well, functional, organized, entirely unlived in. Greta had not broken into this room. She hadn't tried. But her presence was like weather. It got under doors and around window frames and into spaces you'd thought were sealed, not through force, but through the simple physics of existing in sufficient proximity for long enough. He noticed things he hadn't expected to notice. The way she moved around a problem, not just ranch problems, but any problem, even the small ones, the way the lamp was angled or the way a knot in a rope was tied, with that same methodical intelligence that treated each thing as something worth understanding before acting on. The way she read, she had a small stack of books she'd brought with her, German and English both, and she read with a concentration that closed the whole world out, which he found, unaccountably, beautiful. The way she sometimes said something quietly, half to herself in German, when she thought she was alone, not knowing he was within hearing range, and the sound of it, which he didn't understand but which carried a tone of wry affection for whatever she was thinking about, was the most purely private thing he'd ever accidentally witnessed. He did not tell her any of this. But in mid-January, when she came in from helping Reed with a difficult steer and her hands were shaking with the cold because she'd gone out in a hurry, without taking her heavier gloves, he went and found the heavier gloves himself and put them on the table in front of her without comment, and the look she gave him, brief, direct, and warmer than the fire, lived in him for 3 days. On the last Sunday of January, there was a moment that he thought about afterward more than any other. He'd been working at the desk, going over the spring planning, mapping out what the operation needed against what the winter had cost them, when he became aware, without turning around, that she had stopped whatever she was doing and was standing behind him and slightly to the left, looking at the papers spread across the desk. He waited. "The northern field," she said, after a moment. "Yes. If we put the spring planting further east, here," her hand came into his peripheral vision, pointing at the map, "and use this section for a second rotation of the hay crop, you get more yield from the same water access." He studied the map with her suggestion overlaid on it. She was right. Again. As she so frequently was about spatial and agricultural logistics, which was becoming its own kind of argument she was making simply by being consistently correct. "I was planning to do something similar," he said, which was partially true. "I know. I could see it from the way you'd drawn the boundary lines." She straightened up. "I just thought the extension east would give you more room to work with." "It would." He paused. Then, without planning to, "You can see what I'm thinking from the way I draw maps? I can see what you're thinking from most things." She moved back toward the kitchen. "You have a very expressive internal life that you've worked very hard to make invisible. It is more visible than you believe." He turned in the chair to look at her. "That seems like useful intelligence to have and not share." She looked back at him from the kitchen doorway with that almost smile that never quite arrived. "Consider it returned, as a courtesy. You read me just as clearly. You simply pretend that you don't." He turned back to the desk, but the maps in front of him were very difficult to concentrate on for the next several minutes. February arrived in the way of a frontier month that had run out of patience, brutally, directly, without scenic routing. The cold that January had delivered as a pronouncement February enforced as a law. There were mornings when the air outside the door had a quality less like weather than like standing inside a blade, and the 3 ranch hands moved through their work with the particular economy of men who have learned that unnecessary motion in extreme cold is a luxury the body cannot afford. Through all of it, Greta continued to astonish people. Tom had stopped trying to hide his admiration entirely. Charlie, who was 22 and had been raised to believe that the categories of men's work and women's work were solid and self-evident, was somewhere in the middle of a philosophical adjustment that he didn't have the vocabulary to describe, but that was visibly occurring. Even Reed, quiet, private Reed, who gave his affection to horses and withheld it from everyone else, had been observed by Charlie giving Greta a nod of particular respect after she'd talked one of the younger horses down from a panic without raising her voice or her hands, just standing very still in the stall and speaking low and steady in German until the animal came to her. "What did you say to it?" Charlie asked her afterward. "I told it the cold wouldn't last forever," she said, "and that it wasn't alone." Charlie thought about this for a day and a half before deciding he needed to write a letter to his mother in Virginia, which was the first letter he'd written home in 8 months. Elias, for his part, was navigating something he had no prior map for, the experience of a life that was becoming, against his will and by degrees too gradual to identify and resist, something larger than it had been. Not noisier, not less controlled, just larger, as though the walls of it had moved outward, or he had, and the space between him and the edges of things had changed. He thought about it in practical terms because that was how he thought. The ranch was running better, the food was better, the accounts were better, the men were more settled. These were measurable outcomes. These could be entered in a ledger. What couldn't be entered in a ledger was the thing that happened on the evening of the 14th of February, a date he neither knew nor cared about, when he came in from the barn to find a single candle burning on the table, which was unusual, and Greta sitting at her sewing, which was not, but looking up with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for something and has finally heard it arrive. "You're later than usual," she said. "One of the mares is showing signs of trouble. I want to check on her again in a few hours." "I'll go with you." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." She put down the sewing. "I want to." He stood in the warmth of the kitchen and looked at this woman, at the candle flame in her gray eyes, at the practical hands that had learned the shape of this ranch over 4 months, at the face that had become, without his consent or awareness, as familiar to him as the mountain line outside his window, and felt, with sudden and undeniable clarity, the particular weight of a man who has spent years building walls for protection and has just now realized that what he built them around was an emptiness and not a treasure, and that the treasure arrived after the walls were built and had been, slowly and patiently and with total disregard for his architectural intentions, filling the emptiness from the inside. He didn't say any of this. "There's coffee," he said instead. "I know. I made it." She stood, picked up her coat from its hook. "Is the mare in the main barn or the south paddock?" "Main barn." "Let's go," she said. He held the door open. She went through it into the cold and he followed, and behind them the candle burned in the empty kitchen, steady and patient, going nowhere. Outside, the stars above Montana were extraordinary. That particular excess of February nights when the cold scours the air clean and the sky comes so close it seems almost a kind of pressure. They walked side by side in the dark, not touching, their steps crunching in identical rhythm through the packed snow, their breath rising in twin columns that dissolved together into the enormous dark. The mare was fine. Greta stood at the stall door and talked to her in that same low voice she used with all the animals. Not German this time, but English, soft and unhurried, while Elias checked the horse's flanks and breathing and confirmed she would be all right through the night. On the walk back to the house, the cold between the buildings was remarkable. That specific Montana cold that has no malice in it, only enormity, that reminds you without cruelty that you are small and mortal and temporary and that the land will go on after you with perfect indifference. "I don't think I've ever been anywhere this cold," Greta said, not with complaint, just as a statement of data. "You get used to it." "I don't think I want to get used to it. I think I want to keep being surprised by it." She pulled her coat tighter. "Things you've stopped noticing can't move you anymore. And this?" She tilted her head back to look at the stars, her breath going up like smoke. "This should still move people." He looked up. The stars wheeled overhead, unchanged and unreachable and enormous. He thought about what she'd said, about noticing, about being moved, about the walls he'd built around an emptiness and what had happened to it. He didn't say anything, but somewhere in the deep silence of the man he'd spent 36 years becoming, something that had been closed for a very long time turned slightly on its hinges. Not open, not yet, but no longer sealed, and the cold air got in, and it did not feel like loss. It felt almost like beginning. The hinges had moved, but the door had not opened. That was still where things stood in the first week of March, when the weather made its final, most ferocious argument of the season. Elias had been ranching in Montana long enough to know that the worst storms of winter didn't always come in January or February. Sometimes the land waited. gathered itself through the coldest months like a man drawing a slow breath, and then exhaled in March with a violence that caught people who'd started thinking about spring with the particular cruelty reserved for the optimistic. He knew this. He'd planned for it. He'd laid in extra provisions in February and reinforced the barn's south-facing wall, and told Tom to keep the cattle close to the paddock for the first 2 weeks of the month, regardless of how the weather looked. He had not planned for Greta to get sick. It started on a Tuesday, the 11th of March, with something that looked at first like simple cold weather exhaustion. She'd been working harder than any of them for weeks, and the accumulated weight of a Montana winter was enough to tire anyone. She ate less at dinner than she usually did. She went to bed earlier than was her habit. Elias noticed both things without commenting on either, filing them under the category of things that bore watching but not yet action. By Wednesday morning, he knew it was more than that. He heard her before he saw her. The particular sound of someone trying to move quietly through a house and not entirely succeeding because they lacked the physical resources they normally brought to the task. When he came into the kitchen, she was at the stove, and she was holding herself with an uprightness that he recognized from his own experience as the posture of someone refusing to let their body's agenda override their will. "You're unwell," he said. "I'm fine." She moved the kettle with hands that were slightly unsteady. "The stove needs more wood." "Greta." "I said I'm fine, Elias." He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, put the back of his hand against her forehead without asking permission, and felt the heat there. Not the warmth of a cold kitchen, not the warmth of exertion, but the deep, wrong, burning heat of a fever that had been building for longer than this morning. "You're not fine," he said. She turned from the stove and looked at him. In the gray morning light of the kitchen, he could see what the darkness of her bedroom and the pretense of her posture had been obscuring, that her eyes were too bright, her face too drawn, that she was winning a very narrow argument with her own legs about whether they were going to hold her up. "It's a fever," she said, with the precision of someone being accurate rather than dismissive. "I've had fevers before. Sit down," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those winter sky eyes, cloudy now with fever, and something that might have been the effort of deciding whether to fight the instruction on principle or recognize that the principle could wait. She sat down. He made the coffee himself, inexpertly, too strong, the way he'd always made it before she arrived, and put a blanket around her shoulders that he'd pulled from the chest in the main room. And then he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the situation with the same methodical assessment he brought to a broken fence line or a failing water pump. "I'm going to send Charlie to town for Doc Ellison," he said. "The roads are passable. Yesterday they were passable." He reached for his coat. "Tom and Reed can manage the morning check. Charlie's the fastest rider." "Elias." Her voice had a quality in it he hadn't heard before. Not weakness, but something that was working hard not to become weakness. "It is a long ride in this cold. Don't send the boy out in this for a fever that will likely break on its own." He looked at her. The fever in her face was something that moved in him with an urgency he had no comfortable category for. "I'll be the one to determine what's worth sending for," he said, and went to find Charlie. Doc Ellison arrived by late afternoon, having made the 20-mile ride in a wind that had been building since noon with the particular deliberateness of something that had decided to become serious. He was a lean, competent man of 60, who had seen enough frontier illness to have shed most of the bedside manner habits that were a luxury of quieter climates. He examined Greta with thorough efficiency, asked questions that were specific and clinical, and came out of her bedroom to find Elias standing in the main room in exactly the position he'd been in since the doctor went in. "Lung fever," Ellison said, pulling on his coat. "Not the worst case I've seen, but not nothing. The fever needs to come down and stay down. Keep her warm, keep fluids in her. Broth, water, whatever she'll take. The fever spikes in the night most likely. You'll need to watch her." "What else?" "I'll leave medicines. The willow bark tincture for the fever. 2 spoonfuls every 4 hours, not less. If she develops a cough that changes character, gets wetter, deeper, send for me again immediately, regardless of weather." He paused. "She's strong. That's in her favor." He looked at Elias with the directness of a man who had learned to say important things simply. "But she needs genuine rest, Mercer. Not her version of rest, which I suspect is doing the work of 3 people while lying down. Real rest. Someone needs to ensure that." "Someone will," Elias said. Ellison looked at him for a moment, then nodded with the particular economy of a man satisfied that he'd been understood. He shook Elias's hand and went back into the cold and the building wind. Elias stood in the empty main room for a moment. Then he went to Greta's door and knocked twice, lightly, which was not his usual approach to knocking. "Come in," she said, in a voice that was thinner than her normal voice and clearly knew it and resented it. He went in. She was in the bed, propped on both pillows, and she had the particular expression of a person who has had a diagnosis confirmed and is now calculating what it costs and how to minimize the cost. Her cheeks were flushed with the fever, and her hair was loose. He'd never seen it loose before, always pinned, always controlled, and its looseness made her look different in a way he couldn't examine because this was not the moment for examining things. "Lung fever," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "I suspected." She was quiet for a moment. "It was the week I spent in the north pasture helping move the cattle. The cold was worse than I'd dressed for on the third day. You should have said something. It was 3 days ago. I didn't know it would become this." She said it without apology or deflection, just information. "How bad?" "Bad enough that you're going to do exactly what Ellison said." He set the medicines on the washstand. "Rest, fluids, the tincture every 4 hours. The accounts, I can manage accounts. The grain inventory needs to be updated by Friday because, Greta," his voice was level and carried something beneath its levelness that made her stop. He sat down in the chair he'd brought from the main room and placed beside the bed. Not close, just placed, positioned for the long watch. "The ranch will function without your management for a week. I ran it for 11 years alone. I am capable of managing it for however long this takes." She looked at him, then she looked at the chair, then back at him. "You're going to sit there," she said. "Yes." "All night?" "As necessary." Something moved across her face that the fever couldn't entirely obscure, a complexity of feeling that he couldn't fully read but that had, at its center, something that looked like being moved by something unexpected. "You don't have to do that," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual, the edge of it softened by the illness into something that was more purely herself than any of her practiced precision. "I know I don't have to," he said. "Go to sleep." She looked at him for another moment. Then she closed her eyes. He sat in the chair and listened to her breathe. The storm arrived in the night. Not the storm that had been building since morning. That one had been a prelude, a weather system clearing its throat. What arrived at 2 in the morning was something categorically different, a blizzard of the kind that the oldest ranchers in the valley talked about with the specific reverence people reserved for things that had humbled them. It came out of the northwest with a sound like the world being torn at its seams, and within an hour it had buried the yard under a foot of new snow and was moving so fast and dense that the barn, 40 feet from the house, was invisible. Elias heard it arrive. He'd been dozing in the chair, not sleeping, some part of him always monitoring Greta's breathing the way a man monitors water, listening for changes in its rhythm that would require action. When the storm's volume changed from serious to extraordinary, he stood, went to the window, and looked out at nothing. Just white, moving white, the lamp inside the house turning the window into a mirror of snow. He checked the fire, fed it, and then checked Greta. The fever had climbed. He could see it in her face before he touched her. The hectic color in her cheeks, the restlessness she couldn't control even in sleep, the slight labor to her breathing that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. He put his hand to her forehead and felt the heat roll off her like something trapped. He did not panic. Panic was not a tool he possessed, and would not have been useful if he had. He went to the washstand, poured cold water into the basin, soaked the cloth, and came back and laid it across her forehead with the steady hands of a man doing a thing that needed to be done. She stirred. "Elias." "I'm here." Her eyes opened part way. The fever in them made them strange, too bright, too searching. "Is it the storm?" "Yes." "How bad?" "Bad enough." He wrung out the cloth and replaced it. "Don't try to sit up." "I wasn't—" She stopped, lay still. "The horses. Tom and Reed are in the bunkhouse. They'll check the horses at first light. The cattle are in the paddock where we put them. They have shelter and feed. They'll manage." He heard the edge in his own voice. Not impatience, but the particular sound of a man controlling a fear he hasn't named yet. and moderated it. "Everything on this ranch is attended to. Everything except you." A silence in which the storm made its own commentary, enormous and indifferent, against every surface of the house. "I'm not accustomed to being the thing that needs attending to," she said quietly. "I know." He sat back down in the chair, kept his hand near the cloth in case it needed replacing. "I know you're not." She was quiet again. Her breathing, he noted, was more shallow than he wanted it to be. He picked up the tincture bottle, measured 2 spoonfuls with the care of a man who had read the label 3 times, and helped her take it. Lifting her slightly, his arm behind her shoulders, feeling the heat of the fever through the layers of fabric and the weight of her against him, which was the weight of a person who trusted, in that moment, that they would be held. He laid her back gently and said nothing. For a while the storm spoke for both of them. Then, in the small and formless hours when the night had no name, and the storm had become simply the world's natural state, and something in him had been stripped down to whatever existed before the 11 years of careful wall building, he spoke. "I had a brother," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. He hadn't talked about Daniel in years, hadn't talked about him to anyone in Montana, hadn't said his name aloud since before he'd left Ohio. But the darkness and the storm and the frightened thing he was holding very still in the center of his chest seemed to have dissolved some barrier between what he would normally say and what he actually meant. Greta turned her head on the pillow toward the sound of his voice. She was not fully awake, not fully asleep, in that fever state that moves between the two like tide. But she was listening. He could feel that. "Younger than me by 5 years, he continued. "Daniel, he was—" He paused, looking for the right word and using it when he found it. "The opposite of me. Loud. All feeling, right on the surface, not a sealed thing about him. My father thought it was a weakness." He was quiet for a moment. It wasn't a weakness. He was the kind of person that rooms got warmer when he walked into them. He heard Greta make a small sound. Not a word, just a sound of attention, of presence. "He died when I was 20. Fever," he said, with a precision that cost him. 3 days. No doctor close enough. I stayed with him." He stopped, and the next words were slower because they came from somewhere that hadn't been accessed in a very long time. "I stayed with him for all 3 days, and I could not fix it. And the only thing I knew afterward was that the stain had mattered, even though it didn't change the outcome. The stain mattered." The storm hammered at the north side of the house with something that sounded like repeated insistence. The fire answered by snapping, and the light moved across the walls. Greta's hand moved on the quilt, not reaching, just repositioning, the small restless movement of fever. And he reached out, without deciding to, and covered it with his. She stilled. He kept his hand where it was. "You're going to recover from this," he said, and his voice was quiet and final in the way of a man making a statement he intends to back with everything he has. "I'm not going to sit here and watch this go the other way. I need you to understand that." A long pause, in which the storm made its case and he made his, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of everything that had accumulated over 5 months of 2 people learning each other's language through the difficult medium of actually living. "I understand," she said, barely above a whisper, but clear, precise, even now, even with the fever burning. He didn't release her hand. Thursday became Friday without meaningful daylight, just a gradual shift in the storm's color from black to white, white to gray, gray to the blinding white of full storm day. Elias did not sleep. He tracked the fever through the night by the heat beneath his palm and the cloth against her forehead, replacing it when it warmed, giving the tincture on the hours, feeding the fire until the wood supply in the house was running low enough that he bundled himself into every layer he owned and went out into the storm to bring more from the woodpile behind the house, which was 40 feet of white fury and 0 visibility and the cold like something with teeth. And he did it 3 times without telling anyone because it needed to be done, and he was the one who was there to do it. Tom appeared at the kitchen door mid-morning, ice on his beard, with the look of a man who had made it through significant weather to get somewhere specific. "How is she?" he said. "Fever's still high, not climbing." Elias poured him coffee without being asked. "Cattle? Held through the night. Lost 1 board on the paddock fence. Reed's fixing it. Horses are fine." Tom drank the coffee and looked at Elias with the eyes of a man who had known him for 6 years and was seeing something new. You been in there all night? Yes. Tom set the cup down. He didn't say anything, which was the most eloquent response available to him. Go back and help Reed with the fence, Elias said. Yeah, Tom said, and pulled his coat back on and went. By Friday evening, the storm had exhausted itself, the way all violent things eventually exhaust themselves, and left the world white and still and profoundly quiet. Stars came out above Montana with that particular clarity that follows a storm, as though the air had been scoured clean of everything that complicated it, and the fever broke. He felt it happen, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a change in the quality of the heat beneath his hand, a settling, a return to something more like a temperature a living body was meant to have. He pressed the back of his hand to her forehead and held it there for a full minute, making sure he was reading correctly, and then he sat back in the chair and did something he had not done in so long. He barely recognized the sensation of it. He put his face in his hands and let himself feel it. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then he straightened, pressed his hands against his knees, breathed. When he looked up, Greta was watching him. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been in 3 days. Still tired, still carrying the aftermath of serious illness, but present in them in the way that had been absent while the fever held her. She was watching him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not the measured assessment, not the almost smile, not the winter sky directness. Something that was none of those things and had no name he knew. It broke, he said. His voice was rougher than usual. I know. She was quiet for a moment. How long have you been sitting there? 3 days, he said, because the truth had become the only available option some hours ago. She looked at him, at the unshaved jaw, the unchanged clothes, the eyes that had gone beyond tired into some territory he didn't have a word for. And something in her face did what it had been doing for months now, that barely visible movement of feeling that contained earthquake. You stayed, she said. Yes. You didn't have to. No, he said. I know I didn't have to. She turned her face toward the ceiling, and he watched her take a slow breath and then another, and when she turned back, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not something new, he understood, but something old that had finally reached the surface, broken through the same way he'd broken through, in the aftermath of the storm that strips everything down to whatever is actually true. Tell me about Daniel, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the chair closer, and he did. He talked through the first hour of the cleared night, not in the halting, reluctant way of a man being confessed, but in the slow, careful way of a man constructing something important out of materials he's been afraid to touch. He talked about Daniel's laugh, which had been loud and real and took up space the way feelings are supposed to take up space. He talked about the farm in Ohio and the particular misery of growing up under a man who believed affection was a structural weakness. He talked about leaving at 22 with enough money and not enough knowledge, and more determination than was entirely rational. He talked about the 11 years of building this ranch and living inside the silence he'd constructed and convincing himself that the silence was enough. He talked, and she listened, and the fire burned low and he fed it, and outside the stars wheeled above the cleared Montana sky in their ancient, indifferent patterns. And when he finally stopped, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My mother used to tell me that the people worth knowing are the ones who are hard to reach, but worth the journey. She said it was true of land and of people. She paused. I did not know when I got on that train what I was traveling toward. I had the facts of you, the letter, the land description, the 2-word reply, and I had decided to make a decision. I am decisive that way. I noticed, he said, but I did not know, she continued, and her voice was very quiet, without its usual precision. Not because the precision was gone, but because precision is not always what a moment requires. I did not know you were going to be someone I would... She stopped. Then, choosing the word with the care of someone who has lived long enough to know that the right word is worth waiting for. Someone I would want to stay for. The fire. The stars. The silence of a house that had been through something and was still standing. The flour is on the correct shelf, he said. The ice house is packed correctly. The eastern fence will hold through the spring melt. She looked at him. You were right about all of it, he said. From the beginning. Every single time. He held her gaze, and there was nothing sealed in him at that moment, nothing managed, nothing archived under operational efficiency. I need you to know that I know that. Her eyes held his for a long moment in the firelight. I know you know it, she said softly. I've known for some time. He reached out and took her hand again, not to steady her this time, not because the fever required it, just because it was there and it was hers, and there was no longer a category available to him that made that feel complicated. She turned her hand and held his back. Outside the window, the stars burned cold and clear above the valley, above the white fields and the steady barn and the sleeping cattle and the frozen creek bed that would, come spring, run clean and high with snowmelt. The ranch lay quiet under the aftermath of the storm that had come and done its worst and left them still there, still standing, still holding. And inside the warm room, with the fire going and the storm gone and the fever broken and the silence finally the right kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because it already is, neither of them spoke for a very long time. They didn't need to. The thing that had been moving toward them all winter had arrived, and it had not arrived with the noise of arrival. No proclamation, no ceremony, no dramatic declaration spoken into firelight. It arrived the way real things arrive, quietly, without asking permission, settling into place like something that had always been there, and had only been waiting for the two people involved to stop looking somewhere else long enough to see it. Elias Mercer sat beside his wife in the dark of a Montana night, holding her hand, and understood, with the same clarity that had always served him when he allowed it full access to the truth, that the man who had written a letter requesting an orderly, quiet, manageable wife had received something so far beyond what he'd asked for that the asking itself seemed, from this vantage point, like the most fortunate miscalculation of his life. He had asked for certainty. He had received Greta, and now, holding her hand in the quiet aftermath of the worst storm the valley had seen in a decade, with the ranch intact and the fever broken and all of his carefully constructed distances finally and permanently and willingly dissolved, he could not conceive of having wanted it any other way. Recovery, Elias learned, was not a single event but a geography, a territory with its own terrain, its own false summits and genuine clearings, traversed at the pace the body dictated regardless of what the will preferred. Greta was not a patient patient. By the third day after the fever broke, she was sitting up and asking for the accounts ledger. By the fourth, she had reorganized the contents of the washstand and identified two things in the bedroom that needed attention. By the fifth, she was standing at the window in the early morning watching Tom and Charlie move through the yard with an expression that Elias recognized as a person compiling a list of things being done incorrectly. The hay distribution, she said, is being handled. Charlie is taking the long route to the paddock when the east gate. Greta. He was standing in the doorway with a cup of broth he'd made himself, imperfectly, with the same dogged competence he brought to all things outside his expertise. You had lung fever 5 days ago. The hay will get there. She turned from the window. She looked at the broth, then at him. You made that. Yes. It smells. She paused with the diplomatic precision of a woman choosing honesty over kindness and kindness over honesty and landing somewhere in the middle. It smells like effort. Drink it anyway. She took the cup. She drank it, which she would not have done 4 months ago without a full assessment of whether the instruction was reasonable. Something in that small, wordless compliance moved through him in a way he'd stopped trying to categorize. Things between them had shifted in the storm's aftermath. Not dramatically, not with any declaration or renegotiation of terms, but fundamentally the way the ground shifts in a thaw. Invisibly at first, then all at once, then just the new landscape, which is what it is and which you learn to walk on. They did not speak about what had passed between them during those 3 days and nights. They didn't need to. It existed between them like a physical fact, like the eastern fence line, or the spring-fed creek, or the mountains at the valley's edge. Something that had always been part of the property, and that both of them simply knew the location of without needing to have it mapped. She was fully on her feet by the end of the second week of March. Not at full capacity. That took another 2 weeks, and Elias watched it happen with an attention he didn't bother to conceal anymore. The same way he no longer bothered to pretend he didn't notice when she was tired or when something had troubled her or when the almost smile that never quite arrived had arrived, finally, completely, on a morning when he'd done something clumsy with the coffee pot and sworn at it, and then looked up to find her watching him with an expression of complete and undisguised delight. He'd stared at her. "You," she said, "are a different man when no one is watching. You're watching." "I," she said, "don't count. You've stopped performing for me entirely. I find it very endearing." He had picked up his coffee and said nothing, but something in the back of his chest had done something he'd given up trying to name. Spring came. The thaw arrived in the second week of April and ran the creek high and fast and cold with snowmelt, and the valley turned colors that happened every year but managed to feel like something new each time. The brown going to green in stages, the hills softening, the sky climbing higher. Elias dug the drainage channel along the eastern fence line with Tom and Reed over 3 days, exactly where Greta had pointed on the map in November, exactly the dimensions she'd described from her father's land in Hamburg. When it was done and the fence posts were re-anchored and the melt ran clean and redirected down the channel and away from the line, he stood looking at it for a moment before walking back to the house. She was in the garden, turning the first beds for planting. She'd been expanding the garden since February. On paper, in the evenings, with the focused planning of someone who had looked at the available land and calculated exactly how much more it could produce than it currently was. She had additions in mind, rotations, a companion planting scheme she'd learned from her mother that she'd been adapting to Montana's shorter growing season with the same methodical intelligence she brought to every problem. He came and stood at the garden's edge. She was on her knees in the turned earth, and she looked up at him with her face open to the spring sun and her hands dark with soil. "The channel worked," he said. She looked at him. "Did you expect it not to?" "I expected it to work," he said. "I just wanted to say it did." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with that clear sky steadiness. "Thank you," she said, "for digging it. Thank you for knowing where to dig it." A beat. Then she smiled fully, completely, without reservation, in a way he had not seen on her face before. Not the contained, almost smile, but the actual thing, unheld and unmanaged and honest, turned up at him in the April light. And it rearranged something in him permanently, the way a flood rearranges a riverbed, leaving a new channel that would carry the water from then on, regardless of what the old geography had been. He looked away at the mountains because looking at her directly in that moment was more than his remaining defenses could manage. "I need to check the north pasture fence before afternoon," he said. "Of course you do," she said, with warmth in her voice that was not mockery, and went back to the garden. He went to check the fence, but he walked the long way around. April moved into May, and the ranch came alive in the way a working property comes alive when winter releases it. The sound of it changed, the smell of it changed, the whole character of the operation shifting from survival mode into something more like ambition. The cattle went back to the outer pastures. The horses went into the fuller rotation. The planting began and the 3 ranch hands moved through longer days with the particular energy of men who had made it through the bad season and were now on the other side of it. And something else was alive in the house. It didn't have a moment of origin, or if it did, that moment was the storm, the fever, the 3 nights in the chair, the hand held in the dark. But it was present now the way the spring was present, everywhere, inescapable, growing. Greta and Elias had dinner together every evening, which had technically been true since October, but was now a different thing. Not 2 people at the same table managing proximity, but 2 people who came to the table deliberately, who had things to tell each other about the day, who sometimes talked for an hour after the meal was finished without either of them suggesting that it was time to do something else. He found himself noticing things he told her, not reporting the operational facts of the ranch, though he did that too. But noticing things, small things, the way the light hit the eastern slope at certain angles, the behavior of one of the younger horses that told him something about its temperament, a memory that surfaced from nowhere. And he would bring these things to the table the way you bring something you found on a walk, not because it was useful, but because you wanted to show it to someone. She did the same. Stories from Hamburg, observations about the ranch's animals, which she'd developed deep and specific opinions about. Thoughts on things she'd been reading. The particular dry humor she kept in reserve and deployed when she was fully comfortable, which made him laugh in a way that was new, Not the brief, controlled acknowledgement of something clever, but actual laughter, surprised out of him, which she received with an expression of such genuine pleasure that it made him want to do it again. Tom told Charlie in early May that he reckoned Elias Mercer had been replaced by a reasonable man, and he wasn't complaining. Charlie, who'd been watching the change with the fascinated attention of someone for whom this was the most interesting education available on the frontier, agreed. Reed said nothing, but was observed, on a Tuesday morning, to bring Greta the first wildflowers from the north pasture without any explanation for doing so, which was so uncharacteristic that Charlie wrote home about it, and Tom decided the whole valley had been altered by something he couldn't name but recognized as significant. Margaret Holt noticed it the first time she saw them together in town, early May, when Elias brought the wagon in for supplies, and Greta came with him as she'd been doing since she recovered. Margaret was sorting mail when they came to the counter, and she watched what she watched without making it obvious that she was watching. Elias reaching across automatically for the heavier box before Greta could lift it, not with the pointed chivalry of a man making a gesture, just with the unthinking instinct of someone who has become accustomed to attending to a specific person. Greta saying something quiet to him as they turned to go, and his face changing in the way faces change when something gets through the ordinary surface of them. Margaret told Alma Schreiber that afternoon that she owed Hank Bellamy an apology because she'd told him to stop putting money on the Mercer marriage, and she'd been wrong. The question was never whether it was going to survive, only whether those two people were going to figure out what they actually had. "And have they?" Alma asked. "Oh, they figured it out," Margaret said. "I'd say they figured it out in February. They're just living it now." What Margaret couldn't see because it happened inside the house was the particular evening in the middle of May when Greta came to Elias with a piece of paper, not the accounting ledger, not a ranch map, but a piece of the good paper she used for her own correspondence, and set it on the table in front of him. It was a plan, a full plan, laid out with her characteristic precision, the numbers carefully calculated, the projections realistic rather than optimistic because she didn't make optimistic projections, only honest ones. A plan for expanding the operation, not incrementally, not cautiously, but seriously. A second herd, a third pasture section that adjoined the north property line and that she'd researched was potentially available for purchase, additional hay production to support both, a third bunkhouse structure for the extra hands the expansion would require. He read it carefully, all of it, twice. "This would take everything we have," he said. "Yes." She sat across from him, hands folded, meeting his eyes directly. "And it would double the operation in 3 years, possibly less, if the second herd performs. I've run the numbers on the low-performance scenario. It still works, at a slower pace." The land purchase. The Patterson family's north section. I asked Alma Schreiber carefully about the situation, and she believes the Pattersons may be considering selling in the fall. If we move first, we're in a strong position. He looked at the paper again. He thought about what he'd built here, the 11 years of it, the careful, solitary accumulation, the philosophy of not reaching further than the reach of what he had. He thought about the evening Greta had told him she'd come west because she needed space to be the size of a person she actually was. He thought about what she'd done with the space she'd found here, what she'd added, what she'd changed, what she'd improved, every single time, without exception, when she'd had the room to work. He thought about Daniel, who had been all feeling on the surface, and had been right about that, had never been wrong about that. He put the paper down. "We'll need to speak to the bank in Billings," he said. She was very still for a moment. "You're serious?" "The numbers are sound. You don't make unsound numbers." He looked at her across the table, and there was nothing sealed in him and nothing held back. "And you've been right about everything else." She looked at him, and something moved in her face that she did not manage or contain. Just let come, and it came. Not the almost smile, not the clinical assessment, not the quiet satisfaction of being correct. Something that was beyond all of those, something that had the particular quality of a person who has been fighting their whole life to be taken seriously and has just, in a specific and irrevocable moment, been taken seriously in the way that actually matters. "You should know," she said, her voice careful and precise in the way it was when she was being most honest, "that when I wrote that letter to the agency, I almost didn't send it. I thought—" She paused. "I thought I was asking for too much." A farm, a fresh start, a partner who would let me be what I was instead of something smaller. She looked at the plan on the table between them. I thought the wanting of all that was too much to expect from one decision. It wasn't, he said. No, she agreed. It wasn't. The kitchen held them in its warmth. Outside the window, the May evening was long and gold and full of the sounds of a ranch in its good season. I'm going to say something, Elias said, and I want you to understand that I don't say things carelessly. When I say something, it means exactly what it says. She waited. I was wrong, he said, about what I thought I needed. I was wrong about the ordering of it, the quiet, the obedience, the absence of difficulty. I was wrong because I was building something that was supposed to be a life, and I was leaving out the only part that makes a life worth the building of it. He looked at her with all 11 years of careful management and measured silence and constructed distance finally and fully put down, the way you put down a thing you've been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. You are the part I left out, and I need you to know that I know that. Greta Vogel, who had crossed an ocean and half a continent in a Montana winter and had never in any of it allowed herself the vulnerability of being uncertain, looked at the man across the table. This hard, complicated, slowly opening man who had spent 36 years building walls around an emptiness and had allowed her, grudgingly, and then gratefully, and then completely, to fill it, and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. Elias, she said. Yes, stop talking and come here. He came around the table and she stood, and what happened next was not dramatic in the way of stories that need drama to carry their weight. It was quiet and warm, and had the particular gravity of two people who have earned a moment through the long, difficult, necessary work of becoming people who deserve each other. June arrived, and the valley was green and alive with it, and the ranch prospered in the way a well-managed and genuinely loved property prospers. Not effortlessly, never effortlessly, but with the deep satisfaction of effort that lands in the right place and grows into something. The cattle were fat on the spring grass. The garden was extraordinary. Greta's expanded plan was producing more variety and volume than the ranch had ever had from its kitchen garden, and the ranch hands ate accordingly and were universally grateful in the particular inarticulate way of men who express gratitude through the volume of their second helpings. Tom turned 52 in June, and Greta made a cake from a recipe she'd adapted from a German original, and the five of them, Elias, Greta, Tom, Charlie, Reed, sat on the porch in the long summer evening and ate it. And there was conversation and even laughter, genuine laughter, the kind that rises without permission and doesn't apologize. And Elias sat in it and did not feel, for the first time in 11 years, like a man slightly outside the warm circle of things. He was inside it. He had been let in, or had let himself in. He'd never been entirely sure which. And the inside of it was nothing like he'd feared and everything like the thing he'd been refusing to want. July brought the first real test of the expanded plan. The land negotiation with the Pattersons, which Greta had initiated with Alma Schreiber's careful assistance and pursued with the same strategic patience she brought to everything, reached its conclusion when Walter Patterson rode up to the ranch on a Thursday morning and sat at the kitchen table and accepted the offer that Elias had put together and that Greta had refined to be fair enough that Patterson felt respected and firm enough that there was no room for countermaneuver. Patterson left with the agreed price and a handshake and the slightly dazed expression of a man who'd been out-negotiated so gracefully he hadn't noticed it happening until it was over. When the door closed behind him, Greta looked at Elias across the table. "The north section is ours," she said. "It is." He looked at the signed agreement in front of him, acres that doubled their grazing capacity, that opened the operation to the expansion she'd planned, that were the first concrete step of a future neither of them had been able to fully see 6 months ago, but could now see clearly. "You should have been in business," he said. "I am in business," she said. "Your business, which is now our business." He folded the agreement carefully and placed it in the leather folder where he kept the important documents. He thought briefly of the letter under the floorboard, the one she'd written to the agency, that he'd read until he'd memorized it, that had started all of this. "I am not a quiet woman when I believe something important needs to be said." He thought he should probably retrieve it from under the board and put it somewhere more dignified, somewhere it could be found in 100 years and tell the story it actually told. He would do that later. Right now there was work. There was always work, and neither of them resented that. It was the nature of the life they'd chosen and built, and were choosing again every morning. And the work was good work, the kind that left you tired in a way that felt like completion rather than depletion, that built something visible and lasting out of human effort, and that said, at the end of every long day, that you had not wasted the day, that the day had become something. August came in hot and dry, and the cattle managed it, and the new section's grass held, and the ranch ran as Greta had projected it would, in her careful, honest numbers, and Elias walked the expanded property one evening in the long, late summer light, alone, which he sometimes still needed, the solitude now a chosen thing rather than the default condition of his life, and looked at what this place had become. The fence lines ran true. The barn stood solid. The house. He turned to look at it across the yard, the warm light in the kitchen windows, the garden alongside it full and green and orderly in Greta's particular way, which was not the rigid order of control, but the organized order of someone who understood how things wanted to grow and worked with that rather than against it. The house looked, for the first time since he'd built it, like somewhere a person actually lived. Not a man managing a property, not a transaction in operation. A life. A real one. Built from 2 worlds and 3 disasters, and 1 letter crossed out 20 times before it said what it meant. And another letter whose most important line was not the list of capabilities, but the honest admission that she was not going to be quiet when something needed to be said. He stood in the August light, and the length and fullness of it moved through him. Not the tight, controlled feeling of a man accounting for his assets, but the wide-open feeling of a man who has stopped being afraid of how much he has to lose because he has finally understood that the only thing worse than losing something real is never having had it. He walked back to the house. She was in the kitchen, and she heard him on the porch steps and looked up when he came through the door, and that look, that simple, immediate, unremarkable, in the best possible way look of one person seeing another person they wanted to see, was worth the whole of it. Every winter morning, every argument about flower and ice houses and fence lines, every carefully crossed out word. "How does it look?" she asked. She meant the property. She meant the north section. She meant the expanded version of the thing they were building. He looked at her across the warm kitchen, in the light that fell the way it fell in this house and no other, in the life that was this life and no other. "It looks exactly right," he said. She nodded and turned back to what she was doing, and he hung his coat and washed his hands and sat down at the table and was home. The first Christmas they celebrated together, there had been no decoration in the house. Greta had been too recently recovered from the fever to do much beyond survive it, and Elias had not celebrated Christmas with any intention since before his father died. The day had passed quietly. A better meal than usual. A small fire. The 2 of them at the table with the particular new warmth between them that had not yet found its full language but was present as undeniably as the weather. The second Christmas was different. Greta had been planning it since October, in the careful, layered way she planned everything. Not extravagantly, never extravagantly, but with the precise application of creativity to limited materials that was one of the things she did better than anyone Elias had ever known. She'd been collecting things since the first frost: pine boughs from the tree line, dried berries from the late-season bushes, fabric scraps from her sewing that she'd been saving without telling him what for. She'd written to her cousin in Chicago and received back a small package that she'd put away in the chest at the foot of her bed, and that he hadn't asked about because he'd learned, over the course of a year, to trust what she was building when she was building it. On the morning of the 24th, he came in from the early barn check to find the house transformed. Not dramatically, not in the way of excess or performance, but every surface of the main room and kitchen held something that hadn't been there the night before. The pine boughs across the mantel, tied with the red fabric she'd saved, the dried berries threaded on kitchen twine in loops around the window frames. The table moved and set with the good cloth she'd brought from Germany that he'd seen only twice before. And in the center of it all, the small package from Chicago, open now, its contents arranged on the mantel beside the pine boughs. 3 hand-painted glass ornaments, deep blue and gold, that caught the firelight and held it, and gave it back changed. He stood in the middle of his living room in his barn coat and looked at what she'd done to it. Tom appeared in the doorway behind him. He'd come to return a borrowed tool. and stopped and looked over Elias's shoulder and said, very quietly, "Well, I'll be." "Go away, Tom," Elias said. Tom left, grinning, and went back to tell Charlie and Reed what the house looked like, which took slightly longer than was strictly necessary. Greta came in from the kitchen with flour on her hands and the calm expression of a woman who has executed a plan correctly and knows it. She looked at him, looking at the room. "Too much?" she asked. Not anxiously. She didn't do anything anxiously, but with the genuine openness of someone willing to receive an honest answer. He looked at the ornaments, at the way the firelight turned in their blue-gold depths, at the pine boughs that smelled suddenly like something he'd forgotten could exist indoors. "No," he said. He stopped, and the word he reached for was not the operational, precise word he defaulted to. "It's right," he said. "It looks like somewhere people live." She looked at him for a moment with that clear, direct gaze. "It is," she said simply. "Now wash your hands. I need help with the bread." He washed his hands and helped with the bread, which was the second time he'd helped with bread and was better than the first by a significant margin because she was a direct teacher who didn't soften corrections. And he was, it turned out, a student who learned quickly when the instruction was honest. That evening, all 5 of them ate at the expanded table. Elias had built an addition to it in November because the original table for 2 had become inadequate in a way that was not uncomfortable but that needed addressing. Tom and Charlie and Reed and Greta and Elias, and there was venison and bread and the preserved vegetables from Greta's garden, and something she'd made from dried apples and cinnamon that she called Apfelkuchen and that disappeared faster than anything she'd ever set on a table. Charlie made a toast, impulsively, the way 22-year-olds do things, with more feeling than form, that involved saying the ranch was the best place he'd ever worked, and that he was grateful, and that he hoped everyone felt as lucky as he did. And there was a moment of the particular silence that falls when something true and earnest has been said in a room full of people who aren't accustomed to saying true and earnest things aloud. And then Tom said, "Hear, hear." And Reed nodded with the minimal eloquence that was his complete range. And Elias looked at Greta across the table and found her already looking at him. He raised his glass slightly. Not a toast, just an acknowledgement. Of the table, the room, the blue ornaments in the firelight, the year that had been the most difficult and most complete year of his life. She raised hers in return, and the almost smile was all the way a smile now, and had been for months. The years that followed built themselves the way good things build, not in sudden leaps, but in the steady accumulation of good seasons and hard ones, of work that expanded and work that sometimes contracted, and the constant choosing, every morning, to continue. The North Section's second full season exceeded Greta's conservative projections by 11%, which was the kind of outcome that made the bank and Billings take a different posture in meetings, and that made Elias's position in the valley shift, not dramatically but perceptibly, from a man who ran a solid, modest operation to a man whose operation was becoming something worth studying. The expansion had been noticed. The quality of the herd was noticed. The management of the new acreage, which combined Elias's knowledge of the land with Greta's strategic planning in a way that produced decisions neither would have reached alone, was noticed. Men came to look. Ranchers from adjacent valleys, some from as far as Billings, who'd heard about the Mercer operation and wanted to see it. Elias received them with the same spare courtesy he'd always offered. He had not become gregarious, would never become gregarious, and had given up apologizing internally for that. But Greta moved among visitors with the ease of someone who had always known how to read a room and give it what it needed, and the combination worked. People left the Mercer Ranch with information they'd come for and an impression they hadn't expected, of something running exactly right, managed by 2 people who were, in some way they couldn't quite articulate, each other's most significant advantage. The 3rd year brought a daughter. Anna Mercer arrived in April, fittingly, in Elias's view, in the season of thaws and new channels, with her father's dark hair and her mother's winter sky eyes, and a set of opinions about her circumstances that she communicated with a force and clarity that made Greta look at the red, furious, entirely certain infant in her arms, and then at Elias and say, with exhausted sincerity, "She's yours." "She has your eyes," he said. "She has your absolute certainty that the world should arrange itself to her preferences." He looked at his daughter, at the small, furious, entirely real fact of her, and felt something move through him that made the feeling he'd had looking at the blue ornaments in the firelight seem like preparation, like a rehearsal for this, the actual thing. Anna, he said, testing it. Greta had chosen it. He'd agreed immediately, which had surprised her because he'd had no counter-suggestion. He'd known, when she said it, that it was right. Anna, Greta agreed, settling the baby against her with the instinctive competence she brought to everything, and the three of them were in the bedroom where Elias had first sat in the chair during the fever, and the light through the window was April light, and outside the ranch moved and breathed in its spring rhythms, and the world had become again larger than it had been. Tom held Anna first among the ranch hands, with the careful terror of a large man given a small thing, and the subsequent expression of someone who has just received information about themselves they didn't have before. Charlie, predictably, was immediate and enthusiastic and slightly overwhelming until Greta told him to moderate the energy, which he did. Reed said nothing but carved a small wooden horse over the following week with a precision that suggested considerable time had been invested, and left it on the kitchen table without comment. Elias put the carved horse on the mantel, next to the blue ornaments. Anna was not a quiet child. This surprised no one who had met either of her parents, and amused most of the people who knew them. She was, from very early, the synthesis of both of them. The relentless, focused determination that was Elias expressed through the total willingness to say exactly what she meant at all times that was Greta, producing a small person who knew precisely what she wanted and could not conceive of a reason why the universe would withhold it. "She gets that from you," Elias told Greta, watching Anna systematically dismantle a fence-building project Tom had set her up with that was supposed to occupy her while the adults worked. "She gets the determination from you," Greta said. "She gets the expression she makes when someone tells her she can't do something from me. The thing she's doing to the fence project right now is entirely her own innovation." He looked at his daughter, who had abandoned the toy fence and was now directing Tom, with great authority and limited success, in the reconstruction of it. Tom, who had managed cattle through blizzards and difficult calves and a decade of Elias Mercer's company, had the look of a man genuinely uncertain who was in charge of the situation. "She's going to run this ranch," Elias said. "She's going to run everything within reach," Greta said, starting with Tom. He laughed, the real kind, surprised out of him, and she looked at him with the pleasure she always took in it, the quiet delight of having produced the thing she still found rare enough to be worth noticing. A second child came the following year, a boy they named Wilhelm after Greta's father, who went by Will from his first month because the ranch hands could not manage Wilhelm with any consistency, and Greta decided practically that a name people could say was more useful than one they couldn't. Will was different from his sister in almost every way a person could be different while still being recognizably from the same family, quieter, more watchful, with Elias's particular quality of observation that cataloged everything and revealed nothing until it had been fully processed. "He's going to be a reader," Greta said, watching Will, at 18 months, sit completely still with a catalog he'd found and study each page with focused attention. "He's going to be an accountant," Elias said. "He's going to be both," she decided, "which is useful." He was both. The ranch grew. Not recklessly, never recklessly, because Greta's plans were honest and Elias's execution was thorough, and neither of them had any patience for the romance of overreach, but steadily, the way things grow when they are genuinely rooted. A third section, a partnership arrangement with a neighboring property for shared water access that Greta negotiated over 3 months with a patience that Elias openly admired and that produced terms better than either party had expected. New equipment, a fourth ranch hand, then a fifth. The operation became, by the time Anna was 6 and Will was 5, one of the most productive mid-sized ranches in the valley, and was being described in those terms by people who had reason to know. Coldwater Creek noticed. The town had been watching since the beginning, had never in truth stopped watching, but the watching had changed in character. What had been this skeptical, entertained observation of a community waiting for a mail-order marriage to fail had become something different. A kind of civic pride, or the closest thing to it that a frontier community expressed, which was the willingness to cite the Mercer operation as an example of what the valley was capable of. Margaret Holt had been known to say to anyone who asked about the local ranching situation that the Mercer place was the best managed property in the county and that if you wanted to know why, you should watch how the two people who ran it listened to each other. It was an observation she'd refined over years, based on the thing she'd first noticed in May of the first year. That instinctive, unconsidered attending of each to the other, and that had only deepened as she'd watched them move through town together over the years, with children eventually in tow, with the particular ease of two people who have negotiated themselves into a real partnership and live comfortably inside it. Hank Bellamy, who had never entirely surrendered his position as the primary chronicler of Elias Mercer's social development, declared one afternoon in the general store that he'd been right all along, that the German woman's arrival had been the best thing to happen to the valley in a decade, and that anyone who'd bet against it had simply failed to look closely at what stepped off that train. "You bet against it," Tom said from the corner where he was waiting for supplies. "I did no such thing," Hank said. "You told me you gave it until spring." "I said I gave it until spring as a conservative estimate, which was my way of indicating I thought it would probably last longer." Hank repositioned his tobacco with dignity. "I have always been supportive." Tom looked at him for a moment, then looked away at the middle distance with the expression of a man choosing not to engage with nonsense on a limited energy day. The children grew up on the ranch the way children raised in working places grow, knowing from early that effort was not optional and that the land required something from everyone on it, but knowing also that the effort was embedded in something larger than survival, in a life that had been built with intention and was worth the building. Anna helped in the barn before she was old enough for school and kept the accounts by the time she was 12 and could argue contract terms, with a completeness that was startling in a young person by 14. Will moved quieter through the operation, but no less thoroughly. He understood the land systems in a way that suggested not just observation, but genuine comprehension, and by the time he was a teenager, he was making suggestions about rotation and water management that his father listened to with the same attention he'd learned to give Greta's suggestions in that first winter. Elias noticed this. It moved him in a way that had no efficient description. Watching his son bring an idea to the table with the careful, studied certainty of someone who has done the work of thinking it through, and watching himself receive it with openness, with actual openness, without the resistance that had been his first response to everything before Greta had taught him through the slow, patient medium of a shared life, that being shown something true by someone else was not a diminishment. He'd been teachable, it turned out. He just hadn't known it until he'd met someone worth learning from. One evening in the fall of their 9th year on the expanded ranch, Anna was 8, Will was 7, the operation running with the deep-rooted steadiness of something genuinely established. Elias was at the desk going through the quarterly accounts when Greta came and set a cup of coffee at his elbow and stood for a moment looking at the papers in front of him. "We are going to need to think about the south section," she said. "I know." He looked at the relevant line in the accounts. "The water access is becoming a limitation. I've been thinking about the Ellison property. The doctor's son inherited it last year and has no interest in ranching." He looked up at her. "You've already been thinking about it." "I've been thinking about it since March." "Of course you have." He shook his head, not with exasperation, but with the affection that had replaced exasperation somewhere in the second year and never reverted. "You could have mentioned it in March. I wanted to have the full picture before I brought it to you. I didn't have it until last week." She sat down across from him in the chair that had been across from the desk for years, positioned there as naturally as furniture finds its place in a room that is genuinely inhabited. "I talked to the doctor's son on Tuesday." He stared at her. "You talked to him?" "Informally. I ran into him at the general store and we had a conversation that happened to include the property." The almost smile was fully a smile now, as it always was when she was doing the thing she did best and knew he knew it. "He's interested in selling. He needs the capital and has no attachment to the land. I think if we move before spring, we can come to terms that work for both parties." He looked at her across the desk, at this woman who had arrived on a platform 11 years ago carrying one large trunk and the address of a reluctant cousin and the absolute uncompromising entirety of herself, and felt the thing he felt every time she did this, every time the intelligence and the planning and the undeflectable forward motion of her came into full expression. Not the old resistance, not even the old reluctant admiration, but something past both of those, something that lived in the place where you keep the things you are most fundamentally grateful for. "Talk to him again," Elias said. "Get it moving. She nodded, stood, and moved back toward whatever she'd been doing when she'd come to bring the coffee. She always had 3 things going, minimum, and he watched her go and then looked back at the accounts, and then looked up again before she reached the door. "Greta," she turned. "I need to tell you something." He set down his pencil. "And I want you to understand that I don't say things carelessly." She waited with the stillness she had for important things. "Everything I have that matters," he said, "I have because you didn't let me have the thing I thought I wanted, because you were exactly what you told me you'd be. In the letter." He held her gaze. "You warned me, and I didn't understand what I was agreeing to, and it turned out to be the only agreement in my life that I would not undo for anything on earth." The room was quiet. The accounts lay on the desk between them, full of the numbers of a life built, a life running, a life that was real and large and growing. She looked at him for a long moment, the winter sky eyes that were not winter anymore, that had not been winter since the storm, since the fever broke, since the hand held in the dark. And she crossed back to the desk and stood beside him and put her hand on his shoulder, and he covered it with his in the gesture that had become, over years, as natural as breathing. "I know," she said, quietly, "Exactly." He turned his head and pressed his cheek briefly against her hand, which was the most he'd ever been in the habit of doing and was, in its restraint and its meaning, entirely sufficient. She went back to what she was doing. He went back to the accounts. The ranch breathed around them in the autumn evening. The sounds of it, the horses and the cattle, and the particular creak and settle of a well-built structure in cooling air. And somewhere in the house, Anna's voice raised in the bright, certain tones of a child who has decided something and is informing the household, and Will's quieter reply, and then Greta's voice answering them from wherever she was with the tone she used for children's arguments, which was the same tone she used for everything, direct, warm, entirely without nonsense. Elias listened to all of it and returned to the accounts and found the numbers, which were good, better than last year, building toward the next year in the steady rising line of something established and growing. And he did the work with the particular satisfaction of a man who knows what he's doing and why and for whom, and who has no distance anymore between himself and the answer to any of those questions. The years continued to give what years give. Seasons of abundance and seasons that tested, children growing into people with their own convictions and trajectories. The ranch evolving as good operations evolve. The community of Coldwater Creek that had once watched the Mercer marriage with skeptical entertainment growing older alongside it. The original observers replaced by new ones who knew the story. Not as something to bet against, but as something the Valley pointed to when it wanted to show what persistence and partnership built between two people unwilling to be smaller than they actually were could produce. Tom retired on a Tuesday in the spring of what would have been his 15th year on the property. Elias shook his hand. Greta gave him the Apfelkuchen he'd requested specifically, and a jar of the preserved apricots he'd been taking home since the second year she'd made them, and a letter she'd written in her precise, forceful hand that said things about him and his work and his place in the life of the ranch that left him unable to say anything for a full minute, which was the longest silence anyone had ever heard from Tom, and which Reed and Charlie and the newer hands witnessed with the solemn attention the moment deserved. Charlie had married by then. A woman from Billings who was, in Greta's assessment delivered to Elias privately, almost certainly going to manage him completely within the first year, and who did. He came back to the Valley and set up a small operation of his own on property adjacent to the Mercers. And Anna and his eldest became, in the way of children raised close together on neighboring land, inseparable in the complicated way that inseparable children often become, which generated its own years of comedy and ultimately its own story, separate from this one. Reed never left. He was simply always there, quiet and constant as the mountain line. Until he wasn't, and when he wasn't, the carved wooden horse on the mantel held a different weight, and Greta moved it to a shelf where it was more visible, and that was how they honored things, by making them more visible rather than less. The letter from under the floorboard, Greta's first letter, the one Elias had read until he'd memorized it, was found by Anna when she was 14, helping her father replace the flooring in his study. She read it with the focused attention of a person finding primary historical evidence, and brought it to her parents at the dinner table and set it between them with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. "You kept it," Greta said, looking not at the letter but at Elias. It was important, he said. You put it with the deed and the water rights. It belonged with the important documents. Anna looked between her parents with the expression of a 14-year-old who is revising upward her estimation of the adults in her life. What does it say? She asked. The part in German. Greta picked up the letter. She looked at it for a moment, at the handwriting she recognized as her own younger self's, confident and precise and slightly desperate in the way of someone being honest at considerable personal risk. She translated the German line that she'd added at the bottom, below the English, below the terms accepted, below the whole careful negotiation of that first communication. It says, she translated quietly, I hope you are someone worth the distance. The table was quiet. Outside, the late evening light of a Montana summer lay long and gold across the valley, across the fences that held and the pastures that were full and the house that was, entirely and irreversibly, a home. Elias looked at his wife across the table, across 14 years and 2 children and a fever and a storm and every crossed-out word that had led to one that was right, and said what he had learned in the long education of a shared life to say when it was true. You got your answer, he said. She held his gaze and the smile came, full, unheld, entirely real, and she folded the letter with the same careful creases it had always had and placed it on the table between them. I did, she said. Eventually. Anna looked at the letter and at her parents and at the room around her, the blue ornaments on the mantel, Reed's carved horse on the shelf, the accounts ledger in Greta's handwriting with her father's calculations in the margins, the table that had been built larger to hold more people, the whole accumulated evidence of a life that had been constructed, deliberately and with difficulty and with complete success, from 2 people who had been brave enough to reach for something they couldn't entirely see yet. She picked up her fork. I'm going to need to hear the whole story, she said, with the certainty of someone who has decided something. Greta looked at Elias. Elias looked at Greta. After dinner, they said, at the same moment, in the same tone, which made Will look up from his plate with the expression of a quiet child who has just witnessed something that confirms a theory he's been developing, and which made Anna set her fork back down with the expression of someone who has just been given more information than she requested and finds it both satisfying and inconvenient. The evening held them all, the light coming through the windows, the ranch settling into its end-of-day rhythms outside, the meal warm on the table, the story waiting to be told to children old enough to receive it, and 2 people at either end of the table who had learned, through every hard and necessary thing, that the distance between what you think you want and what you actually need can be the most important journey of a life, and that sometimes, if you are very fortunate and very stubborn and brave enough to tell the truth in the first letter you write, and every conversation after it, you arrive.